Before we do our first example, let us look at a couple of important terms that are used with Redux. The first term is reducer, which will be a function, and the second term is action, which will be an object. If we use Redux in our application, we'll encounter these terms reducer and action on a regular basis. Please keep in mind that reducer is a function and it takes in two parameters, state and action, and its job is to return the new state. Let's examine this one more time. A reducer function will take in two parameters, state and action, and we have to write code in the reducer in such a way that new state will be returned by the function. And with respect to action, please remember that action will always be an object, and the action object should have a key value pair with the key type. So if you see here, we have an object because we have the curly braces on the left and on the right, and the first key is type. If there is one point to keep in mind when you're getting started with Redux, it is this, that action is an object and it should have type as a key within it. Now let's look at the UI wireframe of the first example that we are going to implement. The first example that we are going to implement is a counter, and this is the UI wireframe of the counter component. There are two buttons over here, minus and plus, and when those buttons are clicked, the value over here should get incremented and decremented. So if plus is clicked when the value is 0, the value should change to 1, and if plus is clicked again, the value should get incremented to 2, and if plus is clicked again, the value should get incremented to 3, and so on. And similarly, if minus is clicked, the value should get decremented by 1 for each click. So let's try to implement this counter component. We want to use Redux for this example. That means we want to place the state related to this component in the Redux store. If we have to identify the state related to this component, we can see that it is this number over here, because this number is going to change when these buttons are going to be clicked. And the way to make any state a part of the Redux store is by creating a reducer that manages that state. So first let us create a reducer for our counter component. So I'm going to select this reducers folder over here, and I'm going to add a new file called counterreducer.js. And as I mentioned earlier, reducer is a function that takes in two parameters, the current state and an action, and it should return the new state. So let's write our reducer function. So I'm going to type function counter reducer, and the first parameter will be state, because when this reducer is called by Redux, it will pass the current state as the first parameter, and the second parameter will be an action. When we write a reducer function, we also have to specify the initial value of the state. So let's write const initial state equals, and let's use an object to represent the state of the component. So I'm going to use the curly braces here, and I'm going to specify the key as value, and I'll specify 0 as the initial value. And we have to pass this initial state as the default value of state over here like this. And now in this reducer function, we have to write code to return new state depending on the action that is passed to this reducer. That means the second parameter over here. So the counter reducer is taking in two parameters. The first parameter will be the current state, and the second parameter will be an action. Like I mentioned previously, action will be an object and it should have a key called type. It can have more keys after that, and there is no restriction on the names of the other keys. But one of the keys has to be type. If we go back to the code, we have to write code over here to return new state depending on action. Let's try to anticipate the different actions that this reducer can receive. So I'm going to add some comments over here, and I'm going to list the possible actions over here. Let's try to write down the possible action objects that this reducer can receive. If we go back to the UI wireframe, we can see that we need a decrement operation and we need an increment operation, because this value can be incremented or decremented. So those are two possible changes that can happen to this state value. So let us try to list the action objects corresponding to those two operations. So one of the operations is an increment operation, and the action object corresponding to an increment operation could look like this, type, and we can specify the type as increment, and the action object corresponding to the decrement operation could look like this, type colon, and we can specify the type as decrement. As per our to-do over here, we have written that we have to write code to return new state depending on action. So we can write a switch statement over here, and we can write switch action dot type, and we can open the curly braces and close it. This type over here is coming from this type over here. So we can write case statements within this switch block over here like this, case increment, and when the type is increment, we want to return a new object with value key as state dot value plus 1. And similarly, if we were to write the code for the decrement operation, we would write case and decrement, because the action is going to have the type as decrement. And for this operation, or for this action, we would return a new object with the key value, whose numeric value will be state dot value minus 1. So we have handled both the increment and decrement operations, or we can say we have handled both these actions in this reducer over here, and depending on the action, we will return a new state object over here. We also have to specify the default case. That means we have to write code about what should happen when the action type does not match increment or decrement. And usually for the default case, we will return the unmodified state. So let's write return state over here. Let me decrease the font size just a little bit, and I'll bring this comment onto one line over here like this. And let us export this reducer now. So I'm going to type export default counter reducer. So our counter reducer is now ready. So now we can add it to the Redux store. And to add it to the Redux store, we'll have to go to the file where we called combine reducers, and that is index.js within the reducers folder. So let's open this file index.js. Let's import our counter reducer here. VS Code is trying to help me with the import statement here, so I'm going to select the first suggestion over here. So we have imported the counter reducer that we just wrote, and now we can specify a key value pair in this object over here. As you can see, the argument that has been passed to this combine reducers is an object. Right now it is empty, but now we will add our first reducer to this object over here. So I'm going to type counter counter reducer, and I'm going to save the file. At this point, if we go to the web page, and if we open developer tools, and if we go to Redux dev tools, and if we select state over here, we can see that there is a key value pair over here. Let's look at the raw value, and as you can see here, there is a key over here called counter, and this counter is this counter over here that we specified as a key within the object that was passed to combine reducers. And the value of this counter key is this object over here that I have selected, and this object is coming from the reducer that we defined. If you look at the value is 0, and that is because we have specified the initial state as an object which has the key value with the numeric value 0. Let's discuss this one more time. The object that we pass to combine reducers, that will form the state tree within the Redux store. Since we have specified counter as the key over here and the counter reducer as the value, we are able to see that within the Redux store like this over here. If we want to access the current state of this counter reducer over here, we can use this key counter like we will discuss shortly. So now we are ready to create our React component counter.